Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to the Battcock 2025 lecture. I'm very pleased to see so many friends of the Oxford Smith School here today with us for this occasion. It is, as you will know, it's an annual occasion, and we always bring someone very, very special to our stage, and we're doing that again this year. As you will know, under the title of Climate Realism, Time for a Reset. And when I read the title, I was texting to some of my friends. I actually put a question mark towards the end, but it's not in the invitation. But we'll see what happens when you step up here in a moment, Dieter. So a warm welcome to all of you, and a particular thank you to Humphrey Battcock, who of course is the man behind this annual event, and a lot of other things that Humphrey has done for us. He is, I've been told, on his way. Somehow he mistook the location, I guess, but he's on his way, so we'll thank him again warmly as he arrives. He is, as you will know, all of you, a long-standing supporter of the Oxford Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, and we really appreciate his ongoing support for everything we do. So I also want to say thank you very much to you here and you as the Dean of New College, the warden, I'm sorry, of New College, in this beautiful, beautiful room. You hosting us here again this year, but in a different location. And I have to say, I sort of felt like walking into the United Nations a little bit. There is the Norwegian wood in the Norwegian room, and there is the Swedish room, which also has a lot of wood, beautiful. And it's really a beautiful space. So thank you so much for having us again this year. And finally, I want to say thank you so much and a warm welcome, and you taking on over here, Cameron, Professor Cameron Hepburn, who I inherited the Oxford Smith School from, this gym that I have the privilege of leading right now. And Cameron, you are, as always, amazing. I'm looking so much forward to you taking the lead here together with our speaker here tonight. So over to you, Cameron.
Thank you very much, Mette. Well, this evening is going to be a cracker. I'm really looking forward to it. Welcome to all of you here to New College. Much has been said. It is a wonderful and indeed the best college in Oxford. I thought we'd start in the provocative manner in which this evening is going to continue. Welcome to those of you who are online. There are 250 people, I think even more, registered on Zoom and YouTube. So we're delighted to have you here as well. And thank you to those who've already submitted questions. So even before our guest this evening, Sir Dieter Helm, has said anything, he has well over a dozen questions headed his way. So that tells you something about what we have in store. This event has already been a ripper, to use an Aussie term. We started, of course, with Joe Stiglitz and Nick Stern, giving us a pragmatic and economically bounded view of where we needed to go a couple of years ago. And then Rebecca Henderson, who's with us this evening, there she is, thank you, with an absolutely fantastic lecture a year ago that really questioned some of the fundamental underpinnings of the system that we have and how we need to change it and embed that change to get there. Tonight's a different event again. As you'll hear, I won't steal any thunder, but what I think I can say confidently is that Dieter is going to make you think. Now, Sir Dieter Helm is Professor of Economic Policy here at the University of Oxford and Fellow at New College. He has been Chair of the Natural Capital Committee, and he has a knighthood for services to the environment, energy and utilities policy. He's a prolific author, key government advisor in the UK and the EU. And I think, I could go on for a long time. Actually, what I really want to say about Dieter is that ever since I walked into his office nearly 25 years ago, he's been a superb mentor to me and a colleague and indeed a friend. And it's been a learning experience having your persistent guidance. Some would call it criticism, but I like to call it guidance. Over the years, and a persistent challenge. And I think I encourage and invite all of you to listen to Dieter with very open ears, because I'm sure I'm absolutely sure he will challenge some of your views. And that's what we're here to do at Oxford in general, in New College in particular. We don't make progress unless we listen to each other in good faith and in good spirit and challenge ourselves and seek to falsify our prior beliefs rather than to confirm them. So in that spirit, Tita, it is a great pleasure to invite you to give the 2025 Battcock Lecture. Welcome.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Cameron. There are many things I'm responsible for which I'm embarrassed by, but if I'm responsible for encouraging you in any way, that's a positive. So thank you for those kind words of introduction. Thank you to the Smith School, and thank you very much to the Battcock family for supporting this lecture this evening. I want to start having set out a title without a question mark, by just clarifying the problem itself that we're trying to address before I look to how well we're getting on addressing the problem, what has and hasn't been achieved so far, why people disagree, and some suggestions about what a reset might look like. The first and most important thing to say is climate change is a perfectly solvable problem. It's not as if it requires some new breakthrough to work out how to get to Mars. We know what the problem is. The science marches on, but an understanding of what greenhouse gases do in the atmosphere, how that works, is essentially late 19th century. It's not new. And climate, of course, has always varied, but it's rapid climate change we're concerned about. We know a lot about the technologies. We know the sun comes up every day. We know there's no shortage of energy. And it is not impossible to use energy in a way that no longer causes climate change. So I want to premise all my remarks with that framework. And within that framework, I always think of climate change not as a unique silo, but in part and parcel of our environmental challenges, and in particular, biodiversity, our ecosystems, etc. And to solve this problem, with the other environmental problems we have, what we need is the sustainable economy. And the sustainable economy is, I tried to describe in my legacy book, an economy which passes on to the next generation a set of assets, particularly natural capital assets, at least as good as we inherited. And assets, I'll come back to, is an important part of this frame, and an important part of framing some of the arguments about economic growth and addressing climate change. And that sustainable economy has, to meet that overarching criteria, certain features which it's hard to disagree with. In the sustainable economy, we would have sustainable consumption. And that means that we, the ultimate polluters, would pay for the pollution we cause. We would pay to provide the public goods of which many of the environmental assets form a part. And we would pay to maintain those assets through time. Capital maintenance will be a charge on us, not a debt to be passed on to the next generation. And those principles, polluter pays, public goods, and capital maintenance, I'll come back to again and again in this lecture, and especially at the end, because once you see the environmental challenge through the lens of the sustainable economy and sustainable consumption, if you like, living within our environmental and wider means, then it leads you to a pathway of thinking about what would have to happen if we genuinely really did want to address climate change. So that's my starting point. This isn't an impossible framework. It isn't like Sartre and the 1968 rebellion says, be realistic, demand the impossible. This is not impossible. This is a perfectly doable proposition. That's quite different from predicting we'll do it, but we have to be clear It's not something we have to invent in the future. So the first question to ask is, well, how's it going? We've been at it for 35 years. Right? If you had sat down in 1990 and been convinced by the Brundtland Report, by the IPCC and others that we ought to address climate change, and you'd been terribly excited by the Framework Convention Agreement of 92, if I told you that every single year since then, we've added 2 parts per million of carbon to the atmosphere, I defy you to claim that that's a success. Every single year, it's been 2 parts per million. And that's the number that matters. We all focus on emissions. We don't focus enough on sequestration. But what matters is how much carbon is there in the atmosphere. That's the number. And it's 424 parts per million. That's a lot higher than 275 parts per million. And it has just gone up. If I was doing slides, I would just show it just like that. There isn't a blip. You can't even see the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And it's just about seeable, a tiny little effect for the lockdowns during the great pandemic. Imagine a world in which you shut down all the air transport, you shut down most transport systems, you shut down most energy intensive industries in the world, and you're still not making a great deal of impact on the parts per million. That is the biggest climate change policy that anyone could have conceived of. And we did it, and it hasn't actually solved the problem. Now, of course, it's temporary, and there are lots of other reasons involved, but it's also, of course, the damage being done on the sequestration side at the same time as emissions temporarily fell, offset quite a lot of what otherwise would have happened. So if your ambition is to stabilize or reduce the parts per million in the atmosphere, well, we ain't achieved anything yet. You could say it could have been even worse. Okay, that's plausible, but it's still pretty disastrous. The second thing to say about how it's going is that for all the forecasts of the demise of the fossil fuels, just stop oil, presumably tomorrow morning, nobody's stopping fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are still over 80% of total world energy supply. Now, there's an argument about which is more efficient than which else, but there's also an argument about what's more intermittent than elsewhere, etc. So you can argue about whether it's 85, 80, you could even argue it's 75, but it's a huge number. And if people are serious about a transition from fossil fuels to renewables, now many people on the green side accept plus nuclear, if you're serious about it, it's not just about whether we can address the additional energy demand that's coming. It means we've got to start cutting into that 80% plus, the coal, the oil, and the gas. And we haven't been much, a couple of percent. By the way, in the remaining 20% or so, most of it is hydro and a bit of nukes, and then some biomass. In that accounting framework, the IEA framework, and you can argue again about the efficiency, wind and solar, these fantastic successes of 35 years, are 2% of the total. We haven't started yet on the scale of what would have to happen. And let me make it slightly worse, because I think that it's incredibly important to be utterly realistic about where we are, given how serious this problem is, rather than kid ourselves that we're going to heat another 100,000 houses or whatever it is tomorrow morning with the latest breakthrough that's coming. The world economy is on a path of growing at about 3%, which is below, in GDP terms, below what it has been growing at about 4%. 2.5% to 3% growth, you can do the number or ask ChatGPT to do it for you, but basically that means there's going to be 2 economies in 2050 compared with 1 now. Just think about that. Think about China, think about India, think about Indonesia, think about Nigeria, think about the United States, think about the EU, and imagine the whole lot again in 25 years' time. And if you carry on doing the calculations by 2100, and we're all promoting economic growth, we all want to lift people out of poverty, we all want to do this stuff, Well, there's 8 economies compared with 1 today by 2100. And you've got to decarbonize all of that, or most of that, to achieve the limiting of the increase in the parts per million. That's huge. Now, there's a brilliant book by a man called Frezzo, which has just recently come out, called, great title, More and More and More. And in that book, he's basically an economic historian. Frezzo effectively, and I'm simplifying and stretching his argument further than I suspect he would want to do so, but for the points of this lecture, I want to use it to illustrate. He makes the point that the very concept of a transition is pretty alien to the energy world. So you might think we had a transition from wood to coal, and then we had a transition from coal to oil, and now we're having a transition from oil to gas. We didn't. The demand for wood went up when coal came onto the frame, and we burn more wood for energy now than we did in the 19th century. The demand for coal increased continuously as oil came into the picture. And the demand for oil continues to increase while gas comes into the picture. And the demand for all 3 fossil fuels continues to increase while we bring wind and solar and perhaps some nuclear power onto the system. There never has been an energy transition. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't have a transition or we can't have a transition, but it gives you a sighting on the challenge. So every time you hear the wind capacity has doubled, solar's doubled, etc., start with a very small number and remember that the increase in demand for energy we now confront, because let's face it, particularly the communications industry, the data centers, all the AI, all that stuff, they're massively energy intensive. Those industries, if we meet the additional increase in energy demand from renewables, that would be a stunning achievement, but it wouldn't be a transition. And then that leads you to the observation that when you look through to 250, ask yourself a question. We burn 104 million barrels a day of oil at the moment. Do you think that we'll be burning any less in 250? Doesn't mean we won't be doing lots of wind and solar, but it's very likely, I think, that we'll still be burning something like 100 million barrels a day. The coal burn, okay, half plus is China. China is the coal economy of our world. That might even off, but it's got to do it in the context of the growing energy demand. So if the share of coal falls from 80, all the fossil fuels fall from 80 back to 60 or something, it's 60%, remember, of a massively larger economy. Okay, so these are really important salutary points to bear in mind when one meets the claim that it's all going swimmingly and we're doing well. I think, on the contrary, that 29 COPs have not delivered the outcomes that people optimistically hoped would happen back over the last 35 years. And I don't think one more heave is going to do the job. Now, if you think one more heave of the current policy is going to do the jobs, and I hope you're right and I'm wrong if you think that, I would love to be wrong about this. But if you think that's the case, then you have to explain not just how it's going to all work so wonderfully going forward in the next 25 or 30 years, but why it hasn't been successful in making that transition. And remember, the transition, not just having some more renewables to take up the extra demand, is out there looking backwards. So the question that I asked way back in about 2012, when I wrote my first book on climate change called The Carbon Crunch, was, why has so little been achieved? And I think that's a very important question to ask. Why have we not got what people hoped, wished for, and predicted we would get by this stage? And there are basically 2 paradigms out there on climate change, and quite a lot of it is heated, almost ideological in both paradigms, and often a conversation of a death between the 2 of them. So, and I stylized these I'm not saying that many people are in either of the extremes I'm going to put forward, but I want to just illustrate the frame. The first lot are really like Dr. Pangloss in Candide, Voltaire's great novel. All is for the best in the best of possible worlds. It's all going swimmingly, and this is an inevitable path which we're going to almost fall into. And every obstacle comes up, never mind, we're going to solve that one. You know, you haven't thought it through properly. This will be overcome. And the way I express that in looking at the debate is those people who say, you know, the renewables are all so much cheaper than the other options. In Mr. Miliband's case, it's 9 times cheaper than gas. And the problems of intermittency, et cetera, are all going to be solved by batteries and related activities and active demand, etc. We're going to be a clean energy superpower. How the legacy of empire lingers on in people's belief about the importance of the United Kingdom in the world, but we're going to be that on homegrown energy. We're going to get out of high and volatile gas prices. I wish it was true, and I wish there was convincing evidence to support that proposition, because the immediate thing that follows is we really don't need to do very much. You know, we didn't need to do very much for the iPhone in my pocket to replace my fixed line. Okay? Markets are always replacing one technology with another, and each one better than the previous one. We don't need subsidies, we don't need support. If I was being outrageous, I would suggest, which I never am, I would suggest that we get outside Parliament and start saying end renewable subsidies now, if they're cheaper. Now, of course, there are good replies to this. Why isn't the pollution costs of fossil fuels being properly priced? You know, how do you do the comparisons of these calculations? And have you seen where the cost curves of these things are going? But that's the optimistic picture. It's all going to get solved. And pretty quick, because any economy which is ridiculous enough to concentrate on fossil fuels is going to be priced out of the market. You know, it's curtains for the United States, particularly under Trump, because they've got all that terribly expensive gas. We've had the largest expansion of oil in US history under Obama and Biden, and Trump won. Went from 7 million barrels a day to 13 million barrels a day. That's all post 2004, 2005 fracking going forward. And now they're lumbered with all this stuff. And we have chosen the cheap route. We've got 9 times cheaper, or however many. And you go back over the last 15, 20 years, you'll see repeated claims to this effect. Surely the energy intensive industries of the world are flocking to get close to our cheap renewables. If only we have the highest industrial energy prices in the developed world. But presumably it's around the corner. But in the optimistic story, you want to be on the right side of history. You want to be on the renewable side. It's going to be cheaper. It isn't going to require subsidy, and it's going to be internationally competitive. Maybe it isn't so far, but that's what's expected. On the other paradigm, we have the ostriches. Some of them really of the dinosaur variety, and some of them of less ostrich-like characteristics. And they're arguments which have hit a deep political resonance, whether we like it or not. Remember, far-right parties on anti-net zero positions won virtually every single election in Europe in the last 12 months or so, with a few exceptions. Policy number 1, anti-immigration. Policy number 2, anti-net zero. So if you want to just dismiss these people, you just have to remember that the arguments that people have made, that it's all cheaper, etc., have not quite registered. And what do these people rely upon? Well, first of all, a fact. UK is 1% of world emissions. And what we do here in terms of global warming, in terms of actual emissions effects, will make very little difference to climate change. Remember, this is a global problem we wish to address. May not like that, but it's true. Now, of course, we've got historical responsibilities. There are all sorts of other reasons we might do this. And remember also, part of the argument for us doing this is world leadership. When I spent, with Andrew there in the audience, 2 weeks being Boris Johnson's personal energy advisor, I have no clear idea when it started, and I don't think Andrew and I ever know when it ended. But in that period of the Johnson government, the government had an official document in which it said that the leaders of China and Russia are going to look to the United States to find out how we did it and learn how to do transitions. Now, that is an argument that we're going to show world leadership in being the first country to get to this net zero point, and everybody else is going to follow. I just think that's a lot of the legacy of empire, to believe that Putin is sitting there thinking, God, I wish I could find out what Boris is doing and how he did it. It's just not serious. So people on the right in politics say, nobody else is doing very much. Look at India, look at the coal burn, look at the coal burn in China, look at what's happening in Indonesia, look at what's happening in the minerals for the new technologies, look in the Congo, and then have a look at Nigeria and across to Brazil, aiming to be one of the 10 largest oil producers in the world. Why are we doing this if nobody else is doing it? And effectively, the serious side of that argument is, this is a collective action problem. Everyone else is free riding. Why shouldn't we? Now, just for the record, I don't agree with very much of this at all, but I think you have to take it seriously as opposed to just dismiss it as being the rantings of demonic people outside the frame. Some of people in that camp actually deny that climate change is taking place, but then once you decide to step outside even the most elementary science, well, you're stuffed in your own particular ideological paradigm that you find yourself in. But we do have those two paradigms, and you can listen to it every day on the radio, you can see it on the television, just two groups talking past each other, but not to each other. And in the context of the UK and of most of Europe, the political consensus, which is so central to a society taking on these challenges, has collapsed. I'll come on to it in a moment. We have 2 of the 4 political parties in Britain who are almost certainly committed to manifesto commitments to repeal the Climate Change Act. If you really want to drive a wedge into the political world and call everyone outside who doesn't understand the net zero framework, beyond the pale, these are some of the results you get. The lack of a political consensus anymore is, in my view, pretty disastrous. And reconstructing a political consensus seems to me to be extremely important with our fellow electors, our fellow citizens, and many who do not agree with what a lot of people in this room, I'm sure, think. So we have to focus down on what we disagree about and see what is amenable to analysis. And there is a lot we disagree about. And it requires both sides of the argument to step back from their automatic assumption of defending the paradigm that they're in and engage in the debate. What does wind and solar cost? That's something people disagree about. There are people who point to the marginal costs, say, well, it's naught, of course it's cheap. There are people who say, oh, but the solar panel's getting cheaper. They're on one side of the equation and can only see the 9 times cheaper version that comes out the other end. Similarly on the wind side, though perhaps not quite so strongly. There are others, and I'm in this camp, which say that what matters is the system cost of technologies and the requirements of the system of augmenting different technologies onto that system. So, for example, an existing system like the UK, adding the first 10, 20%, 30% to renewables is really cheap because you don't have to do very much because the system is basically already sufficiently and rightly over-engineered to include it. 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, 60, 70% of the system, then the marginal cost of adding a bit more is really likely to be very different, because the intermittency then is not within the noise and the spare capacity. It's requiring really quite substantive action. For the net zero electricity target in 2030, which I'll come on to in a second, the NESO estimates, that's the system operator, estimates that we will need 35 gigawatts of gas, 35 gigawatts of gas operating 5% of the time. I think it's 10 to 15 gigawatts of interconnectors to prop up our system when we're in difficulties. And I think 8 to 12 or 8 to 10 or 10 to 12, I can't remember the exact number, of active demand management, which I describe perhaps unfairly as voluntary power cuts. Now, of course, in the latter case, you do need a smart meter to make that work. And this is a country that hasn't even managed to put the smart meters in place, but I'll put those aside, and some of them don't work. Many people, I include myself, said that meters should be in distribution, not supply. It was a serious structural mistake, and it has panned out to be exactly that. Suppliers are not the right people to put meters in place. Other countries, Italy's an example, finished their smart meters in the last decade. Right? We're not there yet. These are the sorts of practicalities that come in the frame. But you need all of that lot to make it work. Remember, we used to have an energy system which could provide for a greater demand of electricity than currently, on about, Arthur will know the answer, but about 70 gigawatts of total capacity. Just think how many gigawatts of total capacity we need to do the same job of keeping the lights on now as we, with our intermittent frame of technology. These are all costs. And reasonable people can disagree about what those are, but it's not enough to simply assert the panel's getting cheaper and therefore renewables are getting cheaper. That won't do. And it's not enough to argue what the costs of renewables are, intermittent renewables, without first identifying what the system already has and what the system characteristics are. These seem reasonable things to disagree about. There is disagreements about the cost of capital. These are capital-intensive assets. We've been through 30 years of low and at times negative real interest rates. Now we're in positive real interest rates. Interest rate goes up. Well, for a nuclear power station, for a solar farm, or for a wind turbine, the most important variable is the cost of capital. Just looking at what the costs of these technologies were in a low cost of capital world doesn't tell you very much about what they're going to be going forward. On the supply chain, well, we know all the difficulties. We're not a manufacturing economy. Nearly everything's imported, including the mining that's required behind these technologies. And, well, you may believe that the supply chain is going to get cheaper. Mr. Trump and others have other ideas, but we have to have these part in the frame. But the final bit in the disagreement is fundamental. If you look back in the history of energy policy, right back in the 1970s, when you get a shock in fossil fuel prices, you get a reaction. France, 52 nuclear power stations. By the way, they built 6 simultaneously at one time, and the economy was massively smaller than the current economy. We can't get one of them up without taking a decade and 40 billion to do it. Okay, so it's perfectly, another example of perfectly possible. Everyone assumed that the price of oil and gas was going to do this, and therefore nuclear power was going to be, well, a bargain. Okay. I have a paper somewhere from the CEGB. I think it's 75, might be 70, energy demand the next 25 years. And they assumed we'd need more than 100 gigawatts by 2000. We needed about 60, something of that order, in fact. We've gone through it again. We have a gas spike. Gas wasn't expensive. It's lower now in real terms than the 10-year average. It's just that. But both political parties preached on about high and volatile gas prices. And now this was the argument for doing the renewables, etc. No, it isn't. The reason for doing the renewables, etc. is climate change. It's not that you're going to get out of really expensive and volatile gas. It's cheap. And the oil price is even lower once you accept that we've had about 25% of inflation since the pandemic started. These are going back to last decade prices. The oil price is 50, maybe lower. And the gas price is then, when you adjust for the real terms, it was about 30 euros. It's about 30 going forward. This is the European price. Well, if you adjust for it, it's cheaper. And the irony of it all is the reason why electricity bills are going to come down is because the gas price is coming down. And it's not because renewables are replacing high and volatile gas price. Now, the current Secretary of State spouts this stuff, so did Kwasi Kwarteng. It's not unique to any particular Secretary of State, but my guess is, and particularly if we were to be successful in decarbonising, then my guess is that the oil price will fall as we move back to the cheaper and cheaper marginal cost oil if the demand comes down through time. And never underestimate the speed of technical change within the oil, gas and coal industries. It's phenomenal. Fracking and what's come with it is a phenomenal amount of technical change. That's not to defend any of those things. It's simply to say, if you do a comparison between renewables and with fossil fuels, you have to not just assume that this lot's all going to have a falling cost curve and the technology change takes place here, but this lot's stuck in the dinosaur fossil here and it's just going to be the same cost. No, no, no. It gets cheaper and cheaper. And the same with LNG gas as well. So taking this forward, I've told a story so far that this is a perfectly solvable problem and that we know what the sustainable economy looks like. I painted a story which is, well, we haven't achieved very much yet. It's pretty dire and it's very, very serious if you imagine you're going to have a transition and you're going to do it in 25 years' time. Business as usual isn't going to do this, okay? And I tried to point out the different paradigms, which I find quite destructive because they've broken the political consensus that there was, which I regard as a necessary continued basis for process. And I've tried to question how we might think about the relative costs of renewables and other technologies going forward. I don't have a conclusion now. I probably do actually, but I don't have a conclusion now. But I think it's quite important that each of these issues are thought about in a system way, not just in a marginal, discrete way. Now, I want to just deal with one other argument before I get to what to do in the reset. It is claimed by this government, by a whole host of European governments, that doing net zero is going to promote economic growth. This is a remarkable claim. And it goes to the heart of what you think GDP growth represents, as opposed to what you think sustainable economic growth looks like. The story about replacing fossil fuel, electricity, for example, but energy more generally, plastics, all those kinds of things with renewables, is, in my view, a brilliant modern example of the broken window fallacy, which Barliat set out in 1850 in a paper which was called What is Seen and What is Unseen. He took the example of some kids smashing some windows. And then the windows were replaced by some glass that did the same job. We've got some fossil fuel gas generators that produce electricity. We want to reduce electricity that's firm power with the same reliability, and we're going to produce it with renewables. Okay. And he says that isn't economic growth. It is GDP growth, by the way, in modern terms. It's not economic growth. It's simply replacing one set of assets by another, and that's what I call capital maintenance. And that has several consequences. One is we should pay for it. We shouldn't borrow and claim this as investment. We should honour our contract with the next generation to ensure that they have electricity like we did. The broken windows need to be replaced with different sorts of glass, but the glass isn't better for producing electricity than the stuff that was there before. And that comes back to, this isn't promoting economic growth at all. This is capital maintenance to make our growth sustainable, to ensure that the assets are fit for purpose for the next generation. So if you put it in the UK context, you're back to 1.5 million houses and all the carbon that's involved in building those. but that's our growth story. Net zero is not a growth story. There is no asset enhancement for the purpose of producing the electricity. And so I would not describe it as GDP enhancing. In fact, I would regard it as a good example of how awful GDP is at measuring where we are. It's like when that flood took place in New Orleans, huge amount of economic activity, extra aggregate demand, et cetera, boosted GDP. You know, why don't we flood all the rest of the cities to get the growth rate up to the highest rate in the G7, which is what our Chancellor aspires for? No, 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 no. Once you look in asset framework, you've got to look at maintaining those assets through time as the duty of this generation to ensure the next comes forward. And that means your bills are going to go up twice. Your bills are going to go up because you have to pay for the pollution you're causing, and your bills are going to go up for the capital maintenance required, which means the sustainable consumption part is lower than the current one. And that's why it's so difficult to deal with climate change, because telling voters they're living beyond their environmental means is not a route, if you were wishing to be a member of parliament, I would suggest that would lead to success for you in your electoral campaign. But it's what's required. We are living beyond our environmental means. We are not paying for the pollution we're causing. We're not paying for the public goods, and we're not paying for the capital maintenance. We are committing the broken window fallacy. So what to do for a reset? Well, first of all, if you want a serious climate change policy, make sure you've got the right target in the first place. That will be a good start. Territorial carbon production is a lousy target compared with carbon consumption. And by the way, not the carbon footprint the government measures, which is a 35 to 40% higher than the carbon territorial emissions. Why? Because they exclude land from this framework. And remember, the soils have about 4 times the carbon of the atmosphere. So pollution from land and land-based emissions and also land-based sequestration are past the frame. So if you really want, as the Climate Change Committee claimed that they were demonstrating in their advice to the government for the amendment of the Climate Change Act in 2019, that we were going to stop causing climate change when we got to net zero. No, we're not, unless everybody else is at net zero as well. And including DRACs as part of your outside your territorial emissions, it just shows you this isn't a serious game about actually stopping causing climate change. This is a huge task. The resources need to be devoted to the purpose, and simply deindustrializing is not the route forward. Now people say, well, okay, the leakage isn't that big. The leakage doesn't measure the companies that did not build plant in the UK. It focuses on those who are leaving, not those who are coming in. So right now, that issue between territorial carbon production and consumption will bear heavily on the data centers when they face the highest industrial electricity prices in the developed world. So the target's wrong. And I can't stress how important that is. If you genuinely as an individual or as part of a society want to stop causing climate change, you have to get to net zero carbon consumption. That's crucial. Now, how does that frame in the context of the next reset, which is about the COPs and the UN process? I mean, there's nothing wrong with people getting together and having a chat, though I think 90,000 people flying and emitting all the carbon that goes with it to some particular destination is not exactly a demonstration of carbon responsibility. They could do it online. And now the leaders don't go, the leaders do it online, perhaps the rest might turn their mind to it. I'm being aggressive about this, but if you think another 29 COPs are going to do the job, then either I've just got it all very wrong at the beginning about how badly we're doing, or there's some special reason why they have failed to make any impact in the past, but they're going to make an impact in the future. Okay? Now, I prefer a different route. I refer to it as bottom up, but Cameron says I should a club. And I regard this as essentially being, if countries unilaterally or groups or areas want to no longer cause climate change, great. The way to make sure that they do that in a carbon consumption world is that they must have a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment. They must charge the same price of carbon, polluter pays charges to imports as with domestic production. Now, a long time ago, Cameron and I wrote a paper on CBAM type mechanisms, and we made the political economy point that anyone who wishes to export their carbon intensive goods to us is exempted from the CBAM if they have a carbon tax at home. And then they can keep the revenues from doing that. Developing countries especially, it's a form of domestic taxation. They can decide what the hell they want to do about it, but it proliferates the carbon price throughout the coalition of the willing through time. And you can argue that some of the things Trump's doing, it's a bit of a stretch, but you can argue that some of the things Trump's doing have some of those characteristics, because they're basically attacking energy intensive industries like steel, etc., with tariffs. Not the ideal way to do it, but the EU's got there. And from my time of advising the European Commission, that's the one great success. There are hundreds of failures I could list out. I would drop the 230 target. It's completely unachievable. And it's very expensive to try and do all this lot in 58 months. You have to pay top dollar for every single item of equipment you need to rush to get to a particular frame. That just agitates the political opposition, bears down on the bills, and doesn't make for a sensible, coordinated build out of grid networks, electric charging, generation capacity, etc. 235 was an ambitious target. If you're going to have one of these, don't come up with a target going to fail to meet and lead to much higher bills, because you'll defeat all the main purposes you're trying to achieve. Of the spending in the UK, in my research, I would spend the money on had the maximum global impact. The global problem, not a British problem. There are some things we have comparative advantage of. One of them is North Sea for wind. It's a great location, shallow waters. Of course you should do that. We also have lots of holes in the ground where we can try out CCS. Might not work, but it's a great place to do it. But there are lots of other things. This isn't a great place to do stuff. And the policy, which says a bit of jam on every possible policy, do everything. It's just outside the capacity of a country like the UK to make a real difference to the world. World leadership is finding those things that have maximum effect on those countries where emissions are going to rise most strongly, or where sequestration might be most damaged. The bit you probably won't like, I definitely would reset the Climate Change Act. Two major parties will have that in their manifestos for the next election. There are good reasons for thinking that what was dreamt up in 2008 may not be entirely the right framework for going forward. And it seems to me that you can either get your placards out and say no change, no change, no change, or you can think about engaging in a debate about what an energy security and climate act would look like, fit for the next 25 years, given where we are. And of course, I'd concentrate on no regrets policies. There's a hell of a lot of stuff in this space that we ought to do anyway. The grid needs upgrading. We need to do a lot about the infrastructure for our energy systems. We need to do a hell of a lot about our local distribution networks. We do need to do nuclear. There are arguments either way, but if you're going to do nuclear, do it properly or don't do it at all. It's no good building a couple of SMRs and seeing if they work. Either you want to build 10 or 20 and get batch production, or you don't. Our policy in nuclear has been to date, let's try 4 different PWRs and see which one works. This is a global world. We actually ended up only trying one of them, but we're going to try 2 SMRs and see which one works. We're in a world economy. This is a world industry. We need to do that sensibly. So these are just some of the resets I put in place. And to conclude, just to stick within my time, I want to come right back to where I started. You know, what happens if there isn't a reset? What happens if nothing happens? What happens if we just carry on in this paradigm frame? Well, this leads back to, if you like, almost a punchline, which I developed in looking at in my book about what sustainable economy looks like, and what I'm looking at in the book I'm just finishing called How It Ends, because it will end. if something isn't sustainable, and I defy anyone in this room to tell me that what we're doing on climate change is sustainable, I similarly would defy you to say that what we're doing on biodiversity is sustainable either, then it will not be sustained. You can't stick your head in the sand like the ostriches and just hope it all goes away. It isn't going to go away. And what that tells you is you can either try to advance towards a sustainable consumption path and a sustainable growth path now, ex ante, or you can pay for it ex post. We're on the path to paying for it ex post. We're on the path to substantial global warming. And in trying to get from here to there, we're doing it in such an inefficient way that we're making it more expensive than it actually needs to be. So I think it's time for a reset, and the reset should be based on realism, not paradigms which within themselves increasingly don't stack up to the evidence available. Either way, climate change will come to an end. It's just a question of at what temperature that happens, unless, of course, there's tipping points, but we've been in the Earth's history to lots of different climates in the past. Pity the people who will suffer the consequences because we imagine we're on a path which is in no need of reset and is going to deliver the answers. My conclusion is it won't, it isn't, and this is the moment to rebuild a political consensus and reset climate change policy, both here in the UK and more generally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dieter. As expected, masterfully thought-provoking, interesting, intriguing, enlightening. I'm sure some of you would say infuriating, and challenging. Now, if like me, you're sitting there kind of taking notes of all of the minor things you think Dieter's got wrong in the talk, I suggest, like me, you put them behind you and focus on the big picture where, as usual, I suspect you're largely, if not entirely, correct. But perhaps that's, maybe we'll have a bit of a discussion about that. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we'll go quickly to the audience here. Thank you, those of you online who have submitted your, I think it's 16 questions already. They come in 4 buckets. There's some about trade, some about growth, some about technology. But the one I wanted to start with, really, because I think it comes to the heart of the optimist versus the ostrich versus perhaps the realist view. I suspect many of us in this room might think of ourselves as slightly on the optimistic side of things. Maybe Rebecca wouldn't. She gave a similarly cracking talk last year with the same premise, that we are not winning. Fundamental change is required. But you've offered quite different perspectives on what that fundamental change looks like. Those of us who think we're not winning, but it is still doable, are looking at those cost curves. And I think at some point you said, there are good replies to the critiques of optimism. Look at the cost curves. And I think probably there are quite a few people in the room who say, yes, look at the cost curves. And renewables may only be 2% on one measure of the energy contribution. Of course, you can pick your measure. It's much larger on other ones. And yes, if you double 0.1%, you only get to 0.2%, but you double 5%, you get to 10. You double 10, you get to 20. You double 20, you get to 40. And before you know it, you've transitioned the system. So I guess the first question to you, and I know you understand these costs, but I think your answer is, I see the costs of the modules coming down, but it's the system costs that are going to trip you optimists up. Do you want to, let's just dig into that a little bit more.
Okay. So it's nice you give me the answer that I'm going to give before I give it to you, but that's fine. The costs will be what they turn out to be, and we'll get lots of surprises. Okay? It's a total surprise to the government that the gas price is falling, not going up, for example. right? So there are lots of surprises out there. And, you know, if you're like me in favor of more market-based systems, the reason you're in favor is you will get those surprises. And you may be right? The optimists, I hate the term optimist, but the optimists may be correct. It's all going to turn out wonderful. Great. Okay. But now you have to ask yourself the following question. Do you base your policy on the assumption it's all going to turn out fine? Or do you base your policy on the realities of what you have to do? And though I'm very critical of the 2030 target, because I think it's unachievable, it does focus minds a lot, because it asks you questions like, what would you really have to do? How much is it going to cost? How many transformers do you want? Well, there's a 4-year waiting list for each one of those. Oh, but you want it tomorrow morning. How much top dollar are you going to have to pay to do that? How much interconnectors are you going to have? And then it asks you other questions about the security of the system, which, I mean, goodness knows what the cause of the Iberian Peninsula event is, but it reminds people a lot that failure of a system is fantastically expensive to the economy as a whole now. You know, we are much more dependent on 24/7 than we ever were before, and the new technologies require more of that. So you look at that and you say, well, what about our system when we've got more intermittency in the frame? Where are the vulnerabilities? Well, you might say, it doesn't matter, we build lots of these interconnectors. Well, you know, they get cut, right? I think it's true. Holly will tell me if I got this wrong, but I think it's true about 30% of our gas comes through one pipeline from Norway. You know, well, I think Nord Stream got blown up, if I remember rightly. These are really hard things to protect against. This is all part of a system which has within it more fragility than it would have if it was an old-fashioned system with nukes, gas, and coal. Okay, now you don't have coal for generation. We, of course, burn a hell of a lot of coal in the stuff that we import that's made from coal, and we pay top dollar for cargoes from the far southeast to keep our coking plant going. But these are all part of the frame. And I think that, you know, trying to work out what the system costs are of our highly intermittent system as you get past the 50% mark is a serious question to examine. I don't claim to know the answer, but I can think of lots of dimensions of it which rest on assumptions that other forms of storage, etc., are going to overcome these difficulties, and don't add those costs back to the renewables that put the intermittency on the system. And when I did the cost of energy review, I wanted equivalent firm power as the basis of our new markets, where those who cause intermittency would pay the cost. Everyone was outraged by this proposition, but of course it would have incentivized and reflected the costs of the additional interruptibles on the system. Just finally, remember, if you have 50% plus on the system, you render the nuclear power stations interruptible as well as the gas stations. You do a hell of a lot of stuff whose economics is dramatically changed by the consequences of that system.
Okay, great. Now I'm going to come to the room in just a second. Arthur's very keen there. There's a hand, and so's Darren, but just one more from me. And this is partly to connect up with last year's lecture, I think. But there's a question online about, aren't you trapped in a scarcity mentality? In fact, I perhaps think the opposite. But don't we need to, in order to absolutely decouple emissions from growth, if that isn't possible, don't we need to kill economic growth? I think that's a question that a lot of people out there online, possibly some in the room, want to hear your answer to.
Okay, so I fundamentally disagree with the degrowth or zero growth approach to these problems. Why? Because in the sustainable economy, there are sources of growth which make future people better off without causing climate change or further environmental destruction. What drives technical progress, what drives economic growth is essentially ideas, technology progress, the constructions around us. You know, am I better off because I've got an iPhone in my pocket, which is probably pretty close to Oxford University's computer in 1980? Yes, that's a massive step forward, which is what economic growth is about. I am not better off by having the kind of GDP growth that's described in the broken window fallacy or elsewhere. So sustainable economic growth is about assets, not about flows, although flows are part of the picture. and it's about their proper capital maintenance, passing them on to the next generation so the next generation can choose how to live their lives with at least the same or better assets than we had. That is not GDP growth. It's quite different, but it is not degrowth. And if you want economic chaos, and if you want the far right to run our countries, then try reducing the economic growth, let alone just holding it constant going forward. I fear for the consequences, sadly, of that, because I don't think people want to see their living standards lowered, although effectively they should if the polluters paid their cost.
Oh, great, great. Let's take 3 questions, and I'm going to bundle up with one online. So Arthur, and then Doan, and then the one that's just come through online. Arthur.
Hi. So I wanted to ask you about another reset, which is, do you think there will be a reset to the political economy of energy in Britain or in the kind of broader West? And the reason I think that's interesting is that, you know, Britain was a sort of energy superpower probably twice in its history, once in the early 20th century, and it was a massive exporter of coal. And then once in the 1980s and 1990s, where it was a massive exporter of liberalization. And the liberalized model was based on 4 principles: private ownership, coordination in markets, not central planning, competition and unbundling, not vertical integration and monopoly, and finally, independent regulation, not governmental regulation. And it strikes me that only one of those things is left. We have given up on the central planning is back firmly. Governmental regulation is essentially back through things like CFDs, capacity markets, all sorts of other mechanisms. We kind of have variants of oligopoly and reintegration in the value chain. And so the only thing that's really left is private ownership. And meanwhile, kind of across the other side of the world, you know, for the optimists in the room that marvel at all those gigawatts of solar being added, it's largely being driven by a country that couldn't possibly be described as a liberalized economy, where state-owned enterprises represent 75% of generation capacity, where transmission and distribution are entirely state-owned, and where the old model of localized energy undertakings that integrate retail and distribution are the dominant model. And so what's left for liberalization?
Okay, so Arthur, I think your characterization is brilliant. And when your book eventually comes out, we should all read it because it is extraordinarily insightful. You're right. The liberalized model was killed in essentially by Ed Miliband in the years before the 2010 general election. The government became the central buyer. So everybody builds a generation unit, has a contract with the state, not with customers. And that's the central idea of the liberalized model, that customers and their agents shop around to get supplies to themselves and vice versa. That's dead. And it's probably never going to return. There are no merchant plants of any seriousness in this frame. So you have to assume that the world going forward is captured by political interests as to which technologies they choose to address the outcomes. And they have chosen. And a different government, and I suspect a different government after 28, 29, will make different choices. And your customer is the government, so you lobby for it. Now, it doesn't mean it's worse or better, but that's part of the frame going forward. The difference I thought you were going to highlight is between your Chinese example or your Russian example, which is actually more apposite, and the European examples, is that the one thing that the state will not use now, which it used to build the great nuclear story in France and elsewhere, is the government's balance sheet, because they run out of money. So we have absurd contractual arrangements for nuclear power stations, all sorts of other things, to connive to get private equity to put money in at higher costs than the state would have done it. Why? Because the private sector is not the sector to absorb political and regulatory risk going forward. And I think the politicization of the regulators in the energy sector is just one more step in that direction. Will it produce a better answer? Well, I think you do need a plan. particularly of the grid. You do need to integrate the grid with where the generation plant comes. The real question now is, do you want to do that through pricing, like zonal pricing and so on, or do you want to plan it and say, this is where the wind farms go, this is where the SMRs go? I think it's the latter, not the former. I know you might disagree with me about that, but this is, we do everything the CEGB did before, apart from use the government's balance sheet. And the other feature of the CEGB was there was no borrowing, except little bits of cash flow in between. All those nuclear power stations in a much smaller economy in Britain were paid out of customer bills. They were capital maintenance, not investment. And that tells you how far our vision of our ambition has collapsed, that we can't even think of a serious nuclear program because the government balance sheet can't cope with it, and we don't have the pay-as-you-go to tell customers what that counts. But we built a 7% increase in electricity demand year on year for 30 years. We built the whole of the capacity out of that out of customer bills. And the French did something similar with their 52 nuclear power stations. Here, we trundle around looking for some private equity firm to do whatever bit it is. It is a very weak position. I think I'm not in favour of the CGB, I'm not in favour of nationalisation, but I think what we have at the moment is worse because it's not coordinated.
Thank you, Arthur. Don't. I can't imagine what you will ask.
So, Dieter, you said you'd love to be wrong, so I want to make you happy.
Excellent.
So
Excellent.
You're missing a key piece of arithmetic. You're thinking linearly rather than exponentially, and you never mention the word S-curve. It's not just that costs of technologies are going down, it's that their deployment's going up exponentially. Solar has been going up at a rate of 30% per year for 6 decades. Okay, all it has to do is do that for another decade and a half. It takes over the entire energy system. Now, it can't hold that exponentially all the way to the end, but it is following an S-curve. We've collected data on 100 technologies, 100 technological transitions. They all follow very, very similar patterns. And the message is very clear. In 5 years, I'll give you even odds and consider you a sucker if you take the bet. Fossil fuels will be lower use than they are now. In 10 years, I'll give you 10 to 1 odds. Okay. And I just want to comment on that. Solar energy has been dropping. It's dropped by a factor of 10,000 since 1958. China might account for a factor of 3. China is not the reason why solar energy has been getting cheaper. Solar energy has been getting cheaper from the get-go. It was getting cheaper at the same rate it's getting cheaper now during the Cultural Revolution. And by 2050, we predict it'll be about $3 per megawatt hour, making energy more than a factor of 10 cheaper than it is now.
Okay.
Okay.
So let me
yeah.
let me reply. Okay.
Yeah.
So you may be right. In this brilliant world, we can just give up on most of the policies. It doesn't cost anything. You don't have to do anything really. It's all going to happen. And you never mentioned the system cost of solar. You mentioned the cost of solar bumped. You never mentioned the cost of the batteries, the storage, the support, the intermittency, the interconnectors, the boats over the top of the interconnectors to protect them, etc. You chose a dimension of the cost which reinforced the answer you arrive at. And what I can't work out ex ante is whether you're right about even the bit you're talking about, but I have deep skepticism that you're right about the system costs of solar on an energy system. And I don't think you've incorporated all the other components, but you may have done so. If you have done so, Doyen, great, fantastic. You know, that story I told you about, we're not making any progress. Well, it's just because we hadn't caught up with history and the technology. It's all now going to be fine. And another 29 COPs, we don't need them because the technology is going to do the whole lot and we are going to have the first energy transition. I don't believe it for a moment, but I'd love it to be true.
Maybe this should be the moment where we announce the Battcock bet.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
And there was an interesting challenge. It sounds like maybe the challenge has been.
No, but he hasn't. But Don hasn't defined what it is that the bet is about. I'm about the system costs of running this world that you're describing, and you're about the S-curve for the solar technology itself.
I'm pretty confident we can get this down in a form and into the New College betting book.
That's great. That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Just make it soon enough, because I won't be around and I don't want to be. I've been making bets about 250, and you know, I'm quite happy that the executors will rule out payment for the amount that comes out of the bets.
The wonderful thing about Oxford is that you have brilliant minds on either side of many of these key questions, and sometimes our debates here, I'm looking at you, Internet and broader world, are just as detailed, if not more so, and sometimes just as vigorous, dare I say, than they are outside. But anyway, that I think is productive. So I'm very pleased we had that little conversation. There's a question online, which I should answer. I think it's channeling Howard. I'm not sure if he's kind of tapping in there to pretend that it's not him asking the questions. But this is about, the question is about progress in non-energy sectors. You focus quite significantly on energy. But what about aspects like the food system? Are we going to see significant technological change in the food system that could significantly reduce non-CO2 emissions, and indeed some CO2 emissions, by transitioning to, say, alternative proteins and the like? What are the prospects there?
Okay, so the first point about that, Cameron, is this exactly illustrates the answer I gave with respect to economic growth. The technologies that are advancing in lots of these territories, food just being one of them, are extraordinary. I mean, just think what genetic technologies do to the possibility of food production going forward. Think about what digital information provides you with what's happening on each bit of the earth, etc. That's the first point. The second point is, actually, in these areas, food, and I'd say plastics and petrochemicals fit into this frame too, are examples of where what people have convinced themselves they want is not necessarily consistent with the path, the direction people would like to go. For example, take the idea that we should all stop eating meat or eat a lot less meat. That's not where the world's going, right? That's not where China's going. That's not where elsewhere's going. You know, we can, and there's lots of work done with Charles Godfrey and others on how you could feed the world and not cause as many carbon emissions as you currently do. And a lot of that's about change of diet, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not where China's going. That's not where Indonesia's going. That's not where Nigeria's going. That's not where sub-Saharan Africa's going. And the question is, how do you get to a system which incentivizes people to live within their environmental means? And then you start thinking about the instruments like taxation and so on you might use in that frame. But they're deeply unpopular. Sugar tax has been a success, but there's lots of resistance. If you think of plastics, I mean, one of the things during the COVID outbreak that struck me was, it's true that people were not flying around in airplanes anymore or believing stuff about things like so-called sustainable aviation fuel or offsets or so on. It's true that stopped. But think how much plastic. I used to watch it go down the Evenlode in the river. I mean, plastic everywhere to handle this, all the face masks, all the component parts, etc. Fabulously useful stuff, and the fastest growing use of oil going forward. So just doing electricity, that's the first thing, that's important, that matters. But that's not enough. And that's when you look at the previous transitions, it's quite likely we'll go on using oil for all this other stuff, while we pride ourselves that oil is not being used to generate electricity, etc.
So before I go for another round, and I can see a couple of hands, just a quick follow-up on that. The key feature of your sustainable economy, which I completely agree with, of course, is that we need to be pricing pollution. The one time I have been involved in a piece of research on the food system, we worked out what the appropriate price of pollution, various forms, damage, etc., would be in meat. And it's the first time I've been called an eco-fascist. So people really don't like you pricing pollution when it comes to their...
You're absolutely right. People like living beyond their environmental means.
They do.
And it's like when people say, oh, the opinion polls show that everyone's in favor of doing something about climate change. They're not in favor of paying to do something about climate change. And that's what you see when they all turn out and vote for reform, etc. Of course, there's quite a lot of people in reform who are actually in favour of doing something about climate change, but that's an aside. So this is fundamental. And there are people who think that human nature is geared to insatiability. My first economics tutorial taught me that the fundamental assumptions of consumer theory were, one, insatiability. Okay, we always want more. And therefore, the question is how to constrain those desires people have to fall within the framework. And economists would always say, put a price on it. People rebel against any suggestion. By the way, Carney's backtracked on the carbon tax in Canada as well. They retreat from these positions. And so therefore they choose more expensive ways of getting the same outcome. Well, regulation isn't cheaper than carbon pricing in many, many circumstances, but people seem to think they're not really paying for something if it's a regulation as opposed to an explicit carbon price. Economists, there are lots of things to criticize about the economists' approach to climate change, but as a general rule, putting a price on things and seeing how the world works takes account of uncertainty in which the corporate and the other lobbying and capture of regulators does not.
So for those who want to just follow up on this question of how do we shift people's values and how do we get to this world, then tune in to last year's lecture, which you'll find online by Professor Henderson, who's here with us today. So another round of questions. I'm conscious that there are ungendered questions online, but males in the room. So Professor Henderson herself, let's hear from you.
Peter, thank you for a fantastic presentation. I was struck that you frame... Thank you for a fantastic presentation. I was struck that you frame yourself as a realist, but didn't talk about some of the costs that are almost certainly coming down the line in terms of adaptation. I know I have very good gossip that at least one European government is planning for major breakdowns in energy systems, transportation systems, food systems as early as 2030. One way to perhaps support political transition, in addition to the great ideas I had in my talk last year, is to begin to highlight the kind of very real costs that are going to hit the society from failing to move. So, and start planning for them and start budgeting them and start talking about them. And I'm struck that you didn't stress that. Should we? Is it useful? Is it a possible pathway?
Well, if you follow my, if you agree with my argument that what we're doing is not sustainable, therefore it will not be sustained, therefore you need to think about adaptation really seriously, okay? And even those who think that we're only 1%, so who cares, can't escape the adaptation costs, okay? That said, some adaptation costs are not that large and some are. So, for example, a third of the Netherlands is already below high water level. Hull is below high water level, by the way. Seawall defences are quite cheap. And we've reclaimed land from the sea in lots of examples. And I think also in terms of the threats, it's true that migration is a very important part. It's true also that the people who are going to suffer most in climate change are not people in developed countries. They're in the developing countries, sub-Saharan Africa, etc., going forward. But it's also true that there are some much more visceral and immediate threats to our energy systems, etc. It's called Russia. It's called cyber attacks. It's called drone warfare. It's called blowing up pipelines. It's drone swarms to take out individual wind turbines in the North Sea. It's those interconnectors get sniped by the new Chinese cable cutting vessel, which is developed precisely for this purpose, being practiced on Taiwan, etc. And so, again, understandably, people live in a carbon silo and they see the threats coming from carbon to their frame. But if I look at the energy world and think about security, defense, and the component parts, then actually, sadly, the climate effects are slow burn, the military effects, and some of the instability issues, like Madrid, whatever the actual outcome. And I'm scared. Think about Madrid, by the way, or Spain. They don't even know. If you want to be resilient, you better know what caused the problem pretty quickly to work back from it. But my general point is, like all things climate change, it's slow burn. compared with the immediate threats. And that's why you see this big switch in Europe from carbon budgets to defense spending and to cyber protection, etc. And you see a really costly thing, which I didn't mention, which is that as the intermittency come on the system, more and more people are investing in standby own generation. You've got a plethora of little gas stations and little diesel generators being put up all over the place. Incredibly inefficient and very polluting, but that's what's going on. And that's why I think that we won't get the message over through adaptation, but we should be doing it. And we should think very hard about land use. And wearing my old natural capital hat, I'm very interested in land use planning, about land use allocation, etc. going forward. And choices like, do you want a solar farm or do you want high grade agricultural land? That's a serious issue and ought to be treated seriously.
Okay, time for one more. So last question of the evening.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. You've talked about the potential of postponing targets from 2030 to 2035, which taken out of context, I think the private sector and government alike could breathe a collective sigh of relief, maybe not the people who are being impacted by climate change. But I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your perspective on the target setting landscape. There's the net zero target that you mentioned already, but then there's also a less than ideal landscape around biodiversity target setting, as well as complexities around political cycles, political will, stagnation, and the feasibility of meeting targets both at a country and global level.
Okay, so I think the first thing to say about a target is make sure you're targeting the right thing. And the second thing is to make sure it's credible and achievable, right? Because it's actually very non-productive to set you a target which you don't achieve, and that undermines faith in targets going forward and is incredibly expensive to do it. Okay, that's what I think's wrong with 230. And it worries me enormously. If I was a private sector investor thinking about bidding into the AR7 round or developing, various bits and pieces that fit into this framework. Now I face two questions. The first one is, so what happens when the target isn't met? Is my asset stranded? Should I rush ahead and get there to make sure it is there, even though it's not going to be used because the other bits aren't going to be in place? There's a coordination place. And what should I do about the fact that in the electorate, roughly half the electorate looks like supporting parties which want to repeal the Climate Change Act in 2029 going forward? Well, what do I do in this frame? This is political and regulatory risk. I can't manage it. It's not within my frame of management capability. It's raising my cost of capital. And, the question I get asked more than any other question in the private sector at the moment is, so are they going to stick to the target, and what happens when they don't get there? And what does that mean for my investments? This is dangerous territory. So I think that if you've got a target which blatantly is not going to be achieved, and I can demonstrate it's going to be extremely expensive, and leaves bits of assets created in advance which are potentially stranded for some time, and it's unclear how it's going to be paid for, it would be better to admit, okay, it can't be done, and come up with a credible target that can. But I come back to the second point, which I made early on in my lecture, which is that make sure you're targeting the right thing, right? Otherwise, you won't have Grangemouth, you won't have Port Talbot, you won't have Scunthorpe, you will lose quite a lot of the car industry, and you'll hit your target. And I'll end with an anecdote. So in those 2 weeks, I'm very non-political, I'm not a supporter of any political party, but in the 2 weeks that I took on this job with Andrew advising Boris Johnson, I believe any democratic government, you should advise them if you're asked to do so, whatever their political persuasion. I suggested to Boris Johnson that I could get his carbon emissions down really quickly in a couple of weeks or so. And he's grinned from end to end. And he said, well, how do you do that? I said, it's very easy, Boris. Why don't you close Grangemouth, close Port Talbot, and hope that Brexit kills off the car industry? Little did I know that 2 of those are now true. And the British car industry is producing at the level it was in the 1950s. That's how you do it fast. And that doesn't produce good results when it comes back to what the electorate think and it doesn't tell you anything interesting about what's going to happen. Well, it does actually. What's going to happen to your targets if you really want to reindustrialize Britain to bring the supply chains home, all that cobalt and nickel and all the refinery stuff and all the manufacturing stuff and all the steel. And you want to bring it all home. Well, a territorial target's going to look pretty bad. And that Boris certainly wouldn't have liked that at the time.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Dieter. So we won't hold you responsible either for the closure of Grangemouth, Port Talbot, or Brexit, for that matter. Certainly not the latter. I just want to close with a few.